Subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Now let me tell you a story. I did not know the woman in the photograph. She was smiling in a quiet way. Not posed, not dramatic, just calm. The kind of smile chosen for memorial programs. The kind that suggested a life lived privately. I stood at the back of the chapel holding a folded paper with her name printed across the front. Margaret Elaine Foster. I read it again and again because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I was only there because of a letter. 3 days earlier, it had arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Cream-colored envelope. My full legal name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You are listed as next of kin. Services will be held Friday at 11. No explanation, no signature, no apology. At first I assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error. Someone else with my name. That happens more than people think. I almost threw it away. But something about the wording stopped me. Listed as next of kin. Not invited, not requested. Listed. As if a decision had already been made without my consent. I called the funeral home. I expected confusion. I expected an apology. Instead, the woman on the phone sounded relieved. Yes, she said. We were hoping you would call. She confirmed the name. She confirmed my phone number. She confirmed my address. I asked how they had my information. She said it was provided by the deceased. That was the moment curiosity replaced disbelief. So I came. The chapel was small, older, wooden pews polished by years of use. The air smelled faintly of flowers and dust. People filled the space quietly. They spoke in low voices. They hugged. They nodded. No one looked at me like a stranger. That should have been the first warning. I sat near the back. I kept my coat on, even though the room was warm. I wanted the option to leave quickly if I needed to. The service began. The officiant spoke about Margaret with familiarity. He mentioned her kindness, her patience, her sense of humor. He spoke as if she had been deeply loved. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. She leaves behind her closest family member. He paused. Her niece. He said my name. Not quietly, not accidentally, clearly, deliberately. Several heads turned. I felt every eye in the room settle on me as if they had been waiting for confirmation. I did not stand. I could not move. My heart was beating too loudly. I was afraid it would give me away. Niece. I was not related to anyone named Margaret Foster. At least not that I knew. After the service, a woman approached me. She was older, late 60s maybe. Her hair was silver and neatly pinned back. You must be Emily, she said. I nodded without trusting my voice. She took my hand between both of hers. Margaret spoke of you often. That sentence landed heavier than it should have. I asked how she knew Margaret. She said they were neighbors for over 20 years. She said Margaret was private but thoughtful. She said she had been worried that no one would come. I asked what she meant. She said Margaret had been waiting for me. Waiting. The reception was held in a small hall behind the chapel. Tables were lined with framed photographs. Margaret at different ages. Margaret standing in different places. Margaret smiling beside people I did not recognize. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A photo of Margaret standing beside my mother. My mother looked younger, early 30s maybe. Her arm was around Margaret's shoulders. They were smiling at the camera like sisters. Because they were. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred. My mother had never mentioned a Margaret. I asked one of the guests where the photo was taken. They said it was from a birthday party years ago. They assumed I remembered. I did not. That night, I drove to my parents' house without calling ahead. My mother opened the door and froze when she saw my face. She did not ask why I was there. She stepped aside and let me in. I placed the program and the photograph on the table. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said something I had never heard before. I hoped you would never find out this way. She told me Margaret was her older sister, a sister she had not spoken to in over 30 years. I asked why. She said because some secrets do not stay buried when you give them air. She said Margaret made choices she could not forgive. She said walking away was the only way to survive. I asked why Margaret listed me as next of kin. My mother did not answer immediately. She asked if Margaret had ever contacted me directly. I said no. She nodded slowly. That sounds like her. She told me Margaret had a daughter, a child she gave up for adoption when she was young. A child my mother believed had been placed with a family far away. I asked what that had to do with me. My mother looked at me carefully. She said Margaret believed I was that child. I laughed at first because it sounded impossible. I had birth records, photos, a childhood, a life that made sense. My mother did not laugh. She said records are not always as clean as people think. She said Margaret spent years trying to prove something was wrong, years writing letters, years calling offices, years waiting for answers. I asked why she never told me. She said belief is contagious, and she was afraid. That night I could not sleep. I kept seeing the faces at the funeral, the way no one questioned my presence, the certainty in Margaret's choice. The next morning I went back to the funeral home. I asked if there were any personal effects left behind. They handed me a small box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all unsent, all addressed to me. Dear Emily, I've been watching from a distance. Dear Emily, if you ever read this, it means I am gone. Dear Emily, I know you do not remember me. Each letter spoke to me as if she knew me intimately. My habits, my personality, my fears. Things she should not have known. I checked the dates. Some letters were written before I was born. That was when the story shifted. Margaret did not believe I was her daughter because she watched me. She believed it because she recognized herself in me. My handwriting, my expressions, my way of thinking. She wrote about hospital records that have vanished, about adoption paperwork sealed without explanation, about a name that appeared and disappeared depending on who requested it. One name appeared again and again. My father. I sat on the floor, surrounded by letters, and felt something inside me fracture. The funeral was not a mistake. It was a message. And now that I had received it, the real story was just beginning. I stayed at the reception longer than I meant to because something about the room felt unfinished and unresolved, as if leaving too quickly would mean missing a detail that mattered. And as people continued to approach me, they spoke as though I belonged there, commenting on how much I looked like Margaret or how she used to smile the same way I did, which unsettled me more than outright suspicion would have. I began asking questions carefully, not the kind that would raise alarms, but small ones that could be dismissed as polite curiosity. How long they had known Margaret, whether she ever spoke about family, whether she mentioned a sister or a niece. And what struck me almost immediately was that the answers did not align, because one woman insisted Margaret never spoke of her sister at all, while another said she talked about her often but with sadness. and a third claimed Margaret once told her she had no living family, which made no sense given the certainty with which the officiant announced my name. When I asked specifically about a niece, the reactions varied even more, with some guests nodding immediately as if it were common knowledge while others looked genuinely confused. And one woman said she believed Margaret's niece lived overseas and did not know the truth yet. A phrase that stayed with me because it implied there was something known to others that had been deliberately withheld from me. By the time I left the reception, my unease had grown into something heavier. Not fear exactly, but the sense that I had stepped into the middle of a story already in motion. One that people around me understood in fragments, but no one seemed willing or able to explain fully. And I drove straight to my parents' house because I needed answers that did not come wrapped in sympathy or speculation. My father was home this time and listened quietly as my mother repeated what she had already told me. That Margaret was her older sister, that they had not spoken in decades, and that it was better left that way. But when I asked my father whether Margaret had ever tried to contact him, he said no too quickly and then corrected himself, admitting she had reached out once many years ago asking only whether I was healthy. And when I asked what he told her, he said he told her nothing more than that I was fine, which sounded rehearsed even as he said it. I asked why Margaret would believe I was her daughter when adoption records existed and my life appeared so well documented, and my parents exchanged a look that felt practiced, the kind shared by people who have agreed not to discuss something aloud. Before, my mother said records are not always as clear as they seem, and hospitals did things differently years ago. Explanations that felt thin, considering the certainty with which Margaret had named me as next of kin. That night, I spread Margaret's letters across my apartment floor again and read them slowly instead of searching for answers all at once, noticing how her tone shifted over time from hopeful to resigned, and how she referenced meetings with offices that refused to release files and phone calls that ended abruptly. And one letter in particular stood out because it mentioned attending my college graduation from a distance, describing the weather and the crowd and a detail about the stage that was not visible in any public photos. That was when I realized Margaret had not been guessing about my life or relying on stories from others. She had been physically present at moments that mattered without ever approaching me. And the thought of someone watching from afar for years without revealing themselves made the room feel suddenly smaller. I returned to the funeral home the next morning and asked whether anyone else had questioned being listed as family. And the director looked confused before explaining that no one had challenged it because Margaret had been consistent in her paperwork for years, listing me as her niece and emergency contact across multiple documents, a level of consistency that suggested intent rather than confusion. By the time I left, I understood that the funeral was not the beginning of the mystery, but the point where it could no longer stay hidden, because Margaret had arranged everything carefully, knowing that once I stood in that chapel and heard my name spoken aloud, there would be no way to ignore what she had been trying to tell me. The first place I went was not a hospital or an agency, but the county records office because it felt neutral and procedural and because I wanted something tangible before confronting anyone else. And when I requested my own birth certificate, the clerk retrieved it quickly without surprise, sliding it across the counter as if this document settled everything. At first glance, nothing looked wrong. My name was printed clearly. My date of birth matched what I had always known, and both of my parents' names were listed without hesitation. But when I compared the certificate number to others issued in the same year, something subtle stood out, because the numbering sequence skipped in a way that did not match surrounding records, as if my certificate had been issued out of order. I asked the clerk whether that ever happened, and she shrugged, saying sometimes paperwork was processed late or resubmitted, explanations that sounded reasonable until I requested a copy of the hospital record associated with the birth. At which point her expression changed slightly, and she told me those files were stored separately and required additional authorization. The hospital no longer existed under the same name. It had merged twice and relocated once, which meant tracking records involved phone calls and transfers and departments that referred me elsewhere. And when someone finally located my file, they told me it was incomplete, that certain pages had been archived separately and others had been sealed at the request of the family. I asked which family. They said they could not tell me. I asked when the request was made. They said years after my birth. That detail mattered because sealed records usually happen immediately, not retroactively. And when I pressed further, the line went quiet before the woman on the phone said I would need a court order to proceed, a phrase that shifted this from bureaucratic inconvenience into deliberate obstruction. I requested adoption records next, even though I had never believed myself to be adopted, and that request returned something stranger than a denial, because the agency confirmed that an adoption had been finalized in my birth year under a sealed file number that corresponded with my hospital record. Yet the adoptive parents listed matched the names on my birth certificate exactly. In other words, according to the paperwork, my parents had adopted their own child. When I asked how that was possible, the agency representative paused and said that sometimes private adoptions were finalized after birth when circumstances changed. Explanations that again sounded plausible until I asked who the biological mother was listed as. She said that information was sealed. I asked whether it could be unsealed at my request. She said not without a judge. By the end of that day, I had 3 documents in front of me that should have told one coherent story but did not. Because my birth certificate suggested a standard delivery, the hospital record implied missing and later sealed material, and the adoption agency confirmed a legal process that contradicted both, creating a paper trail that only made sense if someone had rewritten parts of it after the fact. I brought everything to my parents that evening and laid the documents out on the table, watching their faces as they scanned the pages. And while my mother grew pale, my father remained still, his eyes fixed on the adoption confirmation as if he had always known it would resurface eventually. I asked him why an adoption would be finalized after my birth if I was biologically theirs, and he answered carefully, saying that paperwork had been required to protect everyone involved, and that the details were complicated, which was the first time he admitted there were details at all. I asked whether Margaret's name appeared anywhere in those records. He said no. I asked whether it had ever appeared. He did not answer. That silence confirmed more than words could have, because if Margaret's name had never been there, the question would not have been dangerous. And the longer he avoided my eyes, the clearer it became that something had been intentionally removed. That night, I reread Margaret's letters with fresh understanding, noticing references to meetings with lawyers and comments about timing and phrases like, "too late now," and "they think I do not know." And one letter in particular described her sitting in a courthouse hallway watching my parents emerge from a room without her. A detail that explained why records might have been altered after the fact rather than at the beginning. Margaret had not lost her child through confusion or paperwork errors. She had lost her through a decision that was later sanitized by legal language. And the reason she had waited until her death to force the truth into the open was becoming clearer, because confronting my parents while they were alive had risked denial and silence. But naming me next of kin created a public moment that could not be undone quietly. The more records I requested, the more consistent the pattern became. Information existed, but only in pieces. Dates matched, but names did not. Signatures appeared on documents years apart in handwriting that looked deliberately altered. And each time I was told the same thing, that nothing could be changed now, and that reopening sealed files would cause unnecessary disruption. Disruption to whom was never specified. By the end of the week, I understood that Margaret had not been trying to prove a theory. She had been building a case, and she had left it unfinished on purpose because she knew I would be the only person withstanding to continue it, the only one who could request what she could not, and the only one who would be forced to ask a question no one else wanted answered. Not whether I was adopted, but who had decided. By the time I returned to the hospital system, I was no longer asking as a confused daughter, but as someone following a trail that had been deliberately rearranged, and that change in posture mattered because doors that had been politely closed before now required clearer explanations when I asked why specific files had been sealed years after my birth, rather than at the time of delivery. The administrator I eventually met with was careful in the way people are careful when they know more than they are allowed to say, choosing words that sounded neutral while avoiding anything that created accountability. And when I showed her copies of the adoption confirmation alongside my birth certificate, she acknowledged that the documents were unusual but insisted they were still valid under the law as it existed at the time. I asked who had requested the sealing. She said the request came from legal counsel representing the family. I asked which family. She said she could not disclose that without a court order. I asked whether the biological mother had consented. That question changed the tone of the room. She told me consent was documented but could not be reviewed without judicial approval. A phrase that repeated so often it began to feel like a shield rather than a rule. And when I asked whether the consent was given before or after my birth, she paused long enough to confirm that it had been filed afterward. That detail mattered because it meant someone had time to decide what version of events would survive. I requested the name of the attorney who handled the filing. She told me that information was public record. The name was unfamiliar at first until I looked him up and realized he had represented my father's company for years, handling contracts and disputes quietly and efficiently, which suggested this was not a last-minute legal scramble but a coordinated effort using existing relationships. I contacted his office and asked whether he still practiced. He did. When I requested a meeting, his assistant sounded surprised but not confused, as if my call had been anticipated even if it had not been scheduled. And when I arrived, the attorney greeted me politely and spoke as though he already knew why I was there. He told me he could not discuss past clients, but that he understood I had questions about my history. And when I asked whether he remembered handling an adoption involving my family, he did not deny it, instead saying only that the matter had been resolved legally and ethically at the time. I asked whether Margaret Foster had been present. He said no. I asked whether she had objected. He said objections had been addressed. I asked whether addressed meant dismissed. He did not answer directly. He said choices are often made under pressure and that revisiting them decades later rarely brings clarity, a statement that sounded rehearsed and defensive at the same time. And when I asked whether he would say the same thing if he were the one who lost a child, his jaw tightened before he reminded me that my parents had raised me and that outcomes matter more than process. That was the moment I understood his role clearly. He was not there to explain. He was there to justify. I left his office with the unsettling realization that more than one person had signed their name to my life without my knowledge, and that each of them believed time had turned those decisions into facts rather than choices. That night, I confronted my parents again, this time without questions designed to soften the truth, laying out what I knew about the attorney and the post-birth adoption filing and the sealed hospital records. And when I asked why Margaret had been excluded, my mother cried while my father finally spoke with a clarity he had avoided until then. He said Margaret was unstable at the time. He said she wanted things that would have complicated everyone's lives. He said the decision had been made to protect me. I asked whether Margaret agreed. He said she did not need to. That sentence changed everything, because it reframed the story from one of miscommunication to one of authority, from a family disagreement to a decision enforced by access and influence. And it explained why Margaret spent years writing letters instead of filing lawsuits, because the people who controlled the paperwork were the same people who would decide whether her voice mattered. I asked whether my mother had agreed. She said she did not feel like she had a choice. She said the adoption paperwork had been presented as final and necessary. She said she believed Margaret would move on. She said she believed silence was kinder. What no one had anticipated was that Margaret would wait, not loudly, not destructively, but patiently, building a record of her own in letters and observations and unsent truths, knowing that eventually someone would have standing to reopen what she could not, and that person would be me. By the end of that night, I understood that the funeral had not been an act of grief but of strategy, because Margaret knew she would not be alive to argue, but she could still create a moment that forced recognition, a public acknowledgement that could not be undone quietly or sealed away with a signature. And now that I had followed the paperwork to the people who shaped it, the question was no longer whether the truth existed. It was how much resistance would follow once it was finally spoken aloud. The second lie did not come out in anger or panic the way I expected, but arrived quietly during a conversation that was supposed to be about closure. Because after everything I'd uncovered, my parents assumed there was nothing left to say. And it was only when I asked one final question that the story shifted again. I asked whether Margaret ever tried to stop the adoption after it was finalized. My father answered quickly and said no. My mother did not speak. I asked the question again more carefully this time, not accusing but precise, whether Margaret ever objected formally or tried to reverse what had been done. And when my father repeated his answer, my mother finally said that it depended on what he meant by stop. She explained that Margaret had not gone to court because she had been told it would be pointless, that the paperwork had already been completed, and that challenging it would only hurt everyone involved, and that she had been encouraged to let things go for the sake of stability. I asked who encouraged her. My mother said the attorney. I asked whether Margaret accepted that advice. She said Margaret did not accept it, but she did comply with it. That distinction mattered because it reframed Margaret not as someone who walked away, but as someone who was blocked repeatedly until resistance became exhausting. And I realized then that silence had not been her choice, but the only option left to her once access to the system was removed. I asked my father whether he knew Margaret did not consent. He said he believed she would eventually understand. I asked whether understanding was the same as agreeing. He did not answer. What followed was not a confession in the dramatic sense, but an unraveling. Because as I continued asking questions, my parents stopped defending individual decisions and began describing the atmosphere in which those decisions were made. one driven by fear and urgency and the belief that time could be used as a solution, that if enough years passed, the story would settle into something permanent. They told me Margaret had been struggling emotionally after the birth and that her distress was framed as instability rather than grief, a framing that made it easier to dismiss her objections as irrational rather than legitimate. And once that label had been applied, it justified excluding her from further discussions under the pretense of protecting everyone involved. I asked whether anyone ever checked on her afterward. My mother said she sent cards. I asked whether anyone responded. She said no. I asked whether Margaret was allowed to see me at any point. My father said it would have complicated things. That was when I understood the second lie clearly. The first lie was that the adoption protected me. The second lie was that it protected Margaret too. In reality, it protected convenience and reputation and control. And once those priorities were established, Margaret's role shifted from mother to obstacle. Someone whose grief needed to be managed rather than honored, and whose persistence was treated as a problem rather than a claim. I asked whether my parents ever considered telling me earlier. They said they talked about it. They said the timing never felt right. They said they were afraid of losing me. That fear explained many things, but it did not erase the consequence, which was that Margaret lived the rest of her life believing the truth could only be delivered indirectly, through letters she never sent and observations she recorded quietly, because direct confrontation had been denied to her. I realized then that the funeral was not an act of reconciliation, but of final agency, the only moment Margaret could guarantee that her connection to me would be acknowledged publicly and without permission. Because death removes the ability to argue, but also removes the ability to suppress. When I asked my parents whether they regretted what they had done, neither answered immediately, and that hesitation told me more than a simple yes or no ever could, because regret implies a choice that could have been different, and for years they had convinced themselves there had been no alternative. The second lie was not spoken to me directly until that moment. It was the belief that time would soften what had been taken. Instead, it preserved it. And now that belief had finally collapsed under its own weight. After that conversation, there was nothing left to confront and nothing left to uncover because the story no longer had missing pieces, only consequences. And the weight of knowing settled in slowly rather than all at once as I returned home, with the understanding that identity does not collapse in a single moment, but reshapes itself quietly over time. I stopped searching for more records after that, not because there were no others to find, but because I finally understood what Margaret had wanted me to see, which was not proof for a courtroom or validation from a system that had already failed her, but recognition from the one person who mattered, and that recognition did not require another document to exist. I read her letters again without urgency and noticed how little anger they contained despite everything she had lost, because she was not trying to reclaim the years she missed or punish the people who erased her. She was simply insisting on being acknowledged as part of my story rather than a footnote removed for convenience. In one of the final letters, she wrote about forgiveness in a way that surprised me, not as something she expected or even desired, but as something she believed belonged to the person who had been protected most by the silence. And she said that if I ever learned the truth, she hoped I would not feel obligated to choose sides because the truth itself was heavy enough without carrying blame that did not belong to me. I realized then that Margaret had never been waiting for an apology or a reunion or even justice. She had been waiting for visibility, for the certainty that her role would not disappear entirely once she was gone. And by naming me as next of kin, she ensured that her existence could not be rewritten again without someone noticing. My relationship with my parents changed after that in ways that were not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable. Because trust once fractured does not shatter completely, but it does realign. And while love remained, it no longer felt unconditional in the way it once had. Shaped now by the knowledge that fear can motivate people to make choices they later insist were inevitable. I did not stop thinking of my mother as my mother or my father as my father, but I began holding space for Margaret in a way that felt both unfamiliar and necessary, learning to accept that belonging is not exclusive and that acknowledging one truth does not require rejecting another. I visited Margaret's grave alone a few weeks later and stood there without speaking because words felt unnecessary. And for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like an intruder in her story, but a continuation of it. Someone who could finally carry her name forward without secrecy. The most unsettling realization came afterward when life returned to its routines. And I understood how easily the truth might have remained buried if Margaret had not planned carefully. Because systems reward silence and time smooths over discomfort. And without her final decision to force recognition, nothing would have compelled anyone to revisit what had been done. In the end, the wrong funeral was not a mistake or an act of confusion, but a deliberate interruption. A reminder that stories do not end simply because paperwork says they should, and that even carefully managed truths have a way of resurfacing when the people affected by them are finally ready to listen. I did not leave with answers that made everything easier or relationships that returned to what they once were, but I left with something Margaret never had while she was alive. The certainty that the truth existed and that it mattered, even if it arrived too late to be shared directly. And that was enough to change how I understood my own beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Until we meet again.